Well, good evening, everyone, and it is certainly good to be back. Before we take a trip down the road to the Milwaukee Railroad in Lawrence County, I want to take a little side trip and explain to you how railroads get their names. Let's take a hypothetical situation where we've built a railroad between the towns of Ajax and Acme. And we open up for business as the Ajax and Acme Railroad. A few years go by, and through poor management or bad economic times or whatever, we start having problems and we get sued by people that we owe money to and are not paying it, or we get sued by a bondholder or a stockholder, and for whatever reason our railroad winds up in court and a receiver is appointed by a judge. The railroad is reorganized, new investors are found, and we open up back in business as a new railroad. Meanwhile, a lot of times, they never missed a schedule. It opens up with the same track, the same rolling stock, new money, like I said, and the only difference is generally the common stockholders got screwed. And our railroad has a new name. It has a new official legal name to distinguish it from that previous railroad. And so we're now in business as the Ajax and Acme Railway. Notice the difference. A few years go by and the same situation occurs again, and a receiver is appointed. When we go through this again, this happened time and time again with railroads all over. The majority of railroads went through this. The Monon went through this. Anyway, same thing happens again. We come out of our receivership with a new name. Now we are officially known as the Ajax and Acme Railway. And that article is part of the legal name now, and it wasn't before. Well, a few years go by, and the same thing happens again. And we come out of that reorganization as the Ajax and Acme Railway Company. And company is part of our official name. And at any time along here, if another city is added to our list, sometimes they change the name even in good economic times and all. And it might be very well the Ajax, Acme, and Pacific Railway Company. Well, like I say, this happens not only to railroads, it happens to newspapers too, and you have to watch the masthead. Sometimes it's the Chicago Tribune, and sometimes it's the Chicago Tribune. The Bedford paper has had that same problem over the years. So when you're doing research on railroad history or reading, a lot of times it's hard for you to keep track, so to speak, of the official name of the railroad you're reading about. As an illustration of this, there was an article in the Bedford Daily Mail on December 29, 1910, in a two-paragraph article on the front page titled, "Notice of Change." It describes the change in name of a railroad, and it reads, quote, "The officials of the Southern Indiana Railroad filed notice with the Indiana Railroad Commission Tuesday that the name of the company will be known as the Chicago, Terre Haute, and Southeastern Railway Company." Then there's a sentence and then a new paragraph. And the first sentence of the second paragraph reads, "The Chicago, Terre Haute, and Southeastern Railroad comprises," now it's a railroad. Just two sentences before, he was telling us that it is no longer a railroad, it is a railway. The guy can't even remember what he wrote two sentences ago. Now, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad was the official last name of the Milwaukee when it had Milwaukee in its title. And it was primarily a northwestern and western railroad, and we're going to be talking only about that little nubbin of a place there down in Lawrence County. And Lawrence County railroads primarily were the Monon, the Milwaukee, and the B&O. And you notice, being an old person myself, I tend to use the names of the railroads that we were all acquainted with, all of which have changed. There's CSX and Sioux Line and others. The Monon became the L&N. But I'm using the ones that we're acquainted with, and Lawrence County railroads had the B&O in blue, the Baltimore and Ohio, which is the only one of those railroads that still operates trains. Every other railroad on there is now abandoned and the tracks are gone, except for a little bit of the Monon tracks that are left, but it's officially abandoned. The black on there indicates the Monon, or another railroad that over the years the Monon bought a certain amount of trackage from that railroad, so that became Monon. And the railroad we're discussing this evening is in red, and it's the Milwaukee. Now, Lawrence County had about 120 miles of main line railroads, and Monroe County had about 60 miles. But if you take the quarry fields, and there is an example of a track plan for the Perry Matthews and Buskirk Quarry, which was north of Olytic and east of Old 37. In the year 1910, just in 1 year, that was the track plan for that quarry. And of course, over the years, as the stone was removed and they moved over and quarried other areas there, all those tracks moved around. So if you take these, this amount of trackage for a quarry, although it's a big quarry, but you add it all together and you have scores and scores more miles to add on to that 120 miles. There were a lot of railroads in Lawrence County. Well, this little family tree of the Milwaukee Railroad, forget about everything but what I put in red. In 1886, the Evansville and Terre Haute Railroad established an independent, separate company to build a railroad from Evansville to Richmond. They laid track, and it never got to Richmond. It got from Elnora to Westport. And that's as far east as the Milwaukee ever got. But I don't want to create the impression that there were just tracks ending out in the middle of a cornfield. The little town of Westport had connections with the big four railroads, so you could get on the Milwaukee and travel east and get anywhere in the country you wanted to. But those tracks for that railroad ended at Westport. And he went through Bedford in 1890. Now, we'll refer to it as the Milwaukee, but it didn't get any kind of a corporate affiliation with any one of the names of what was the Milwaukee Railroad until many years later. This is the Evansville and Richmond, and it came through in 1890, got to Westport the same year, went bankrupt in 1894, and placed in the hands of a receiver. In 1897, it was taken over by a group of bondholders led by a man named John R. Walsh. We'll speak more of him later. He was a very important figure in Lawrence County history. Quite soon, he had taken it over exclusively as his own interest, and the bondholders were gone. He had bought them out. So when he became the exclusive owner, he changed the name of the railroad from the Evansville and Richmond to the Southern Indiana Railway Company. So now the Evansville and Richmond has become the Southern Indiana, owned by John R. Walsh. He started building tracks, extending his railroad up to Terre Haute and then further on to Chicago and points west. Enough of this family tree. It's boring. Let's start traveling on the Milwaukee tracks. Now we've got to acclimatize ourselves here to the map. 16th Street is that red street going through the middle. You see John Williams Boulevard up at the top. The hospital over here is just south of 16th Street on the very left side of the screen. And in the upper right, we're going to start where the Milwaukee Depot used to be. And that was the way it looked back in the 1980s, looking west. And if you notice, there's a limestone building peeking at us from around the corner there. A lot of people don't remember that, but it was a well-built structure of the same sort of limestone as the depot. What it was, I don't know. It must have been some sort of storage facility, but it was well built. And that lasted a long time. That hadn't been gone more than 20 or 30 years, if that. And as we all know, the depot got moved downtown and restored. What you don't know is across I Street to the east is the freight depot for the Milwaukee Railroad, or for the old Southern Indiana. This freight depot was an integral part of just about every major depot in any city worth its size. They had a passenger depot and a freight depot. And they weren't always just right next to each other. This is a few hundred yards to the east. Well, we're going to start traveling on the west tracks. This is where the Monon crossed the Milwaukee. And before we actually get on a train and start moving, we're going to talk about the doodlebug for a minute. The doodlebug was famous locally. Wherever vehicles like this appeared around the whole country, they were called doodlebugs. Doodlebug is the name of a car that is a self-contained car. They generally had a gasoline engine that ran an electric generator that actually powered the wheels. And it had a baggage car and a little passenger compartment all in the same vehicle. And often that either traveled by itself or pulled a single passenger car. In 1929, they started this service from Seymour to Terre Haute, but very quickly they quit the part to Seymour, so as long as it lasted, it went from Bedford to Terre Haute. And here we have a better picture of a similar doodlebug on the Milwaukee someplace. And you can see the cabin up there, a baggage compartment behind, and then a passenger compartment in the rear of that single car. That is a doodlebug. Well, as we head west, we're on the Milwaukee down in the lower right corner of that picture. And you see Stalker School up at the very top left with O Street coming diagonally down and Garvey Lane diagonally the other way. That is the first Curver Stone Company, and that building's gone. It's been replaced by little storage buildings where we keep our stuff. And the office building for the first Curver Stone Company is still there. And when you walk along the trail and see it, now you know what you're looking at. And as you move further on, every building in that picture is a stone mill. Every big building. And you can see the office building for the first Curver down the lower right. You see our Milwaukee where we're walking. The site of the Climax Stone Company, I want you to remember that. It's going to come up later. So as we walk along, you'll see on your left an empty, abandoned building. That's right there it is. That is still there, and that was the Bedford Cut Stone Company, Mill B. So when you walk by, you'll know what that is. Further on down on the trail, you'll see that building quite close. That was the John A. Rowe Stone Company up in the upper left there. And you see the tracks are curving to start heading south to go under the 16th Street. The rest of those buildings in there are from the Ingalls Stone Company. Here we are under 16th Street, and moving south on the right-hand side or west side of the railroad is without a doubt the high point of this talk and the high point of your experience walking the trail, or maybe the low point. It all depends on your point of view. If you look off in the wintertime, you will see that structure, and it's hard to see in the summertime with all the leaves. That is a septic tank. And this picture is from Jim Guthrie's history. It was one of the large septic tanks installed by the city in 1923 and served to the 1950s. And there you see a picture I took in 1980 and then in 2014. So you might want to make that walk soon because it's going to be gone someday. Further on down the trail, if you look on the left hand, on the east side, where that star is, you will see the site of the West Bedford Stone Company, which was established in 1892. And in 1895, it was purchased by the Climax Stone Company and moved up to Garby Lane, where I told you to remember where the Climax Stone Company was. And I tried to duplicate that picture. There's our Milwaukee Railroad coming south, starting to turn, going west. I tried to duplicate that, give or take. But if you look to the left, you will see the large stone blocks that tell you that there was a mill there. And if you wander around looking at them, you'll find such things as an example of the quickly placed, lack of talent painted graffiti versus the longer version of semi-talented sculptor graffiti on a rock. And if you want to see what a quarry is like, in the whole district, the easiest quarry for you to get to and walk around and look at stacks of stone in an empty quarry hole and do it safely is right where that star is. The old Norton Quarry is just right by the trail. So it's a good place to take out-of-towners to show them what an old quarry looks like. Well, there's nothing more exciting to see till we get to Williams. And there's the depot on our railroad at Williams. And there's the depot in the 1913 flood. The depot is the building on the left. Our signal tower has come a cropper there. Moving on down a little bit, we'll encounter the feed mill built in 1892, still there as a dilapidated building. It's a race to see whether that or the septic tank lasts longer. And a little further down, of course, is the Williams Dam, the combination hydroelectric and coal-fired power plant. That was finished in 1912, just in time for the 1913 flood, which the water level was up to the windowsills of both the coal and the hydroelectric part. Now, if you don't believe that, look at the hydroelectric part, the part just left of the dam. And think about the damage it did to the generators and other electrical equipment in there. Well, looking out the window of the passenger cars, they would get to see one of Lawrence County's covered bridges. And moving on to the west, you see the railroad starts up a very steep hill after it crosses the road, and just to the north of the tracks, where the arrows indicated, was a quarry. And if you wander around in that quarry, you'll notice there are no smooth walls where channeling machines were used to extract building stone. That's because this particular quarry, there is no quality building stone there. This was a crushed stone facility. John R. Walsh, remember him, he built a crushed stone plant there and quarried his limestone and crushed it and used it as ballast in his railroads. Ballast is what's placed between the wooden ties to hold them in position. And it can be cinders or crushed limestone or crushed other kinds of stone, whatever they used to keep that railroad from moving around. And John R. Walsh was known throughout the industry as having the finest ballasted railroads. And that ballast came from that quarry. Well, if you go about 1,400 yards beyond the county line, the first road, little town we come to in Martin County is Mount Olive. And because I had this slide of the Mount Olive Depot, I threw it in. No extra charge. Well, let's return now from the place from whence we started, which is I Street, And now we're looking at the depot, the freight depot I told you about. And there's an old picture that shows the freight depot when there were some railroad tracks there, more of them. When the railroad first was built, that was their yard where trains were made up. So there were multiple tracks along there. And if we started going east, and when the tracks were there when I took these pictures back in the 80s, so we're almost 35 years ago, just a few hundred yards to the east is where the Milwaukee crossed the B&O southwest. I told you about this in the Monon. This started at Rivervale and came up to Bloomington, and there's where the two railroads crossed. There's where the B&O southwest ran. Now, it doesn't take much to entertain me. I have walked every mile of the 100 miles of abandoned railroads in Lawrence County. Remember I told you there are 120 mainline railroads. Well, the 20 miles are still functioning B&O. I didn't walk that. But the 100 miles of abandoned railroads I've walked. And I can't prove it, but I have a feel for where I walked that the fill that is over Foote's Ravine, where it is circled, would have been the longest and highest wooden trestle on the Milwaukee coming through Lawrence County. Now, when they build railroads, they want to build them fast, they build them cheap, and whenever they cross a valley, they build a wooden trestle. And they worry about changing it to either a fill, where they fill in dirt and stone, and no longer is it a trestle of any kind, or they build a steel trestle later. You're not going to start making any money till you've got tracks laid going someplace. So you build cheap and fast. And this was filled in the 1890s, and remember, 1890 is when the tracks were first laid through there. But it is a huge fill. You walk that, is very dramatic, looking down on both sides into the ravine. And nothing more exciting happens to us till we get to Heltonville. And there's a passenger train sitting at the depot at Heltonville. And here's Heltonville in the early 1900s with the smoke coming from a steam locomotive sitting at the depot in Heltonville. And that picture is from Jim Guthrie's book of another passenger train sitting at the depot in Heltonville. But these were on good days. There were bad days. That was very close to Heltonville, and nobody was killed in that wreck, but everybody got to be in the picture. So when last we saw the family tree chart here, there's the Southern Indiana, which is now owned by John R. Walsh. That railroad was taken over in 1910 and became the Chicago Terre Haute and Southern, and in 1921 it became the Chicago Milwaukee. And there's when Milwaukee's name first enters our corporate history. Well, who was John R. Walsh? He lived from 1837 to 1911. He was a prominent newspaper man in Chicago, and he established the Chicago National Bank and had controlling interests of several other banks in Chicago. He established the Bedford National Bank here in town. Well, as we said before, after the Evansville and Richmond went bankrupt in 1894, it was taken over by the bondholders in 97. And then very soon that year, he exclusively owned it and changed the name to the Southern Indiana Railway Company. In 1891, he provided the money for the Bedford Stone Quarries Company to build the Bedford Belt Railroad. And it couldn't pay the money back, so he took over the Stone Company and the Bedford Belt, which became part of the Southern Indiana Railway Company. And since that ultimately became part of the Milwaukee, that's why we're talking about it. The Bedford Belt was one of the John R. Walsh lines. Well, he was convicted of banking fraud in January 1908 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was paroled in October 1911 and died 9 days after he got out of prison. He's a colorful man. It's too bad somebody hasn't written his biography. Now, his defense at the trial was, well, this is what all the other bankers are doing. The problem with that defense is, if what all the bankers are doing is illegal, you're in trouble. And what they were doing is, what he was doing is, he was using the bank's money as if it was his own personal money. They got laws against that. So now to discuss the Bedford Belt, let's get ourselves acquainted with the geography of the area. There's Oolitic in the middle, and you see the modern 4-lane road heading north to south. And to the left is the Dark Hollow Quarry. At the top is the Perry Matthews and Buskirk Quarry, which was to the east of Old 37. Now, this group knows what Old 37 was. We drove on this highway before the 4-lane was built. And on the west of the Old 37 was the Hoosier Quarry. Now, when the 4-lane was built, the Old 37 was abandoned, and they have quarried all out where that road ran. But back in the era we're talking about, that was the Bedford to Bloomington Highway. Okay. Now, let's back up a little, and if you remember, we'll get to that in a minute. At this time, in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a great bunch of disgruntlement in the limestone industry. Dark Hollow and the companies that existed there was one of the top 3 in size here in the district. And the district was Lawrence and Monroe County. One of the other 3 of the top ones was the ones that John R. Walsh owned up in the Perry Matthews and Buskirk area that we mentioned. Well, you see the Dark Hollow Stone Company and the Dark Hollow Quarry Company. That's all became part of the Consolidated Stone Company, which was one of the top 3 giants. The problem arose because the owners of these companies happened to be also owners of the Monon Railroad. And many of the directors on the Monon Railroad also sat on the boards of these stone companies. And it was generally felt throughout the district that the Monon Railroad was not giving a fair shake to stone companies that were not owned by the railroad. That, all of a sudden there was a shortage of cars that wouldn't be supplied to them, or that the rates were higher to them. So there was discontent. The Monon Railroad officials always denied this and said they were working to improve and give everybody a fair shake and all that. Well, so the Bedford Quarries Company, if you'll recall, that built the Bedford Railroad and went defunct, and John R. Walsh took them over, and he renamed it the Bedford Quarries Company over there. And remember, this is one of the top 3. So now he owns the Bedford Belt and the Okay, to go back to our railroad map, so the Bedford Belt and the Southern Indiana are all one railroad. And they're all owned by John R. Walsh. Now, when you do your reading, I want to make something really clear here now, because even I get it confused. The Bedford to Bloomfield narrow gauge railroad that everybody called the B&B was a whole separate railroad. We talked about that when we talked about the Monon. The Bedford Belt is a whole different railroad. But all those B's will get you confused, and sometimes you'll be talking and reading, and all of a sudden you'll be reading about the wrong railroad in your mind. Well, the stops on the Bedford Belt were the Bedford, North Bedford, Standard, Dark Hollow Junction, Dark Hollow, Oolitic, Buff Ridge, and Hoosier. Everything blue on there, except for the depot down below. Everything blue there was a stone mill on that map. And that group of mills up at the top is where Central Foundry is today. And just south of that is 4th Street running across. The green at the bottom is the Milwaukee. Everybody with me on that? The red is the Bedford Belt Railroad. And naturally it wanted tracks to all these stone mills so it could compete for business with the Monon. And then up at the top, it's heading off toward Oolitic, so it can get stone from the Oolitic quarry area. So we're going to head off of this map and go to this picture. And I don't know when it was taken, but I think this was in the early days of Central Foundry. And you see the Bedford Belt Railroad is curving around Central Foundry and starting to head west to go to Oolitic. And there you see the Breckenridge Cemetery and M Street and the Monon Railroad. And there's where the Monon crossed, or the Bedford Belt crossed the Monon. And in the upper left, back when it was a functioning railroad, the upper right was at 1988 when the Monon was still functioning, and in 2014 when nothing was there. Okay, you see that circle down in the lower right, that's in Central Foundry or the stone mills, depending on how you look at it. And you see where they cross the Monon, the picture. Well, coming west now, you see the Standard Quarry. That's one of those quarries that's close to a lot of things, but nobody knows about it because you can't see it from any road. So it's just kind of a secret quarry back in there. And then it crosses Old Highway 37, and you see where I've indicated that. But just before it does, there's a stream and a valley there, and you see that trestle. And you could always see that looking east from Old 37, until they removed it, of course. And that's what it looked like when it was built. It came through the county in 1890, I said, but it hadn't really opened for traffic until 1893 when the whole railroad and all its facilities and the trestles were built and all that. And then just 3 years later, we had a terrible accident in which 5 men were killed when this happened. You know, a 3-year-old wooden trestle collapses. The railroads were a dangerous place to work. And that's a picture from Jim Guthrie's book. And of course they rebuilt it as a steel trestle, probably thinking that maybe we should have done that at the beginning, but. Okay, you travel just a little bit beyond, maybe a half a mile or so, and that's where the railroad went under Old 37. Now, in the last year or two, that has all been filled in, so no longer is that a bridge over the old right-of-way there. It's all filled in. If you're traveling on the road, you don't notice that, because it still looks like a bridge. But if you get off and look down underneath, you could not walk under the Old 37. Now here we are with that same slide of a map I showed you earlier, and the arrow indicates exactly where we were, where the Milwaukee went underneath Old 37. Everybody with me? And we're heading west. And right there is, once again, can't prove it, but in my gut feeling, is one of the steepest railroad grades in the county. If you think if you're going from Bedford to Oolitic on the Oolitic Road, Old 37, you get out and you go down a steep hill in your car till you get down to Salt Creek Bottom. A railroad's got to do that too in order to get down to the bottom. And there's where it crossed Salt Creek, the railroad. We're talking about the Bedford Belt. And when the next slide was taken, you could stand on the bridge of the 4-lane and look east and see that. I'm sure a lot of you remember seeing that bridge there. Well, that has been removed. That was removed when the tracks were removed. Now we're going to zero in on that red square area of map, with Dark Hollow up in the left, one of the major core areas, and that what you see Louisville, and that's the Monon Railroad. It had originally been the Bedford Belt. This is the trackage. See, I did it. I told you. This was the old Bedford and Bloomfield, the B&B. And the Monon bought it, and we'll see where it ran, but this was their switch back into Dark Hollow. Now look at those red arrows there. If you're traveling south in the wintertime on the 4-lane, I want you to look off to the right or to the west, exactly 1 mile south of the blinker light, or there's a stoplight at Olytic on the 4-lane. And you see the topographical maps show you obviously a man-made structure. Those are fills where railroads used to run. And if you look off into the woods, it's hard to get a picture of. You see that running there? You can just barely make it out. What you're seeing is that fill. And there's the 4-lane up there. And it's a fill because they didn't want their railroad flooding every spring like Salt Creek Valley certainly did before Lake Monroe. And it still does occasionally. Well, anyway, the red indicates where the spur from the Bedford Belt went over to service the Dark Hollow core area. So both the Monon and the Bedford Belt would be competing for stone business in Dark Hollow. Probably a dumb idea on the part of the Bedford Belt, because the majority of the Dark Hollow stone industry was owned by Monon board members. So you got, probably the Bedford Belt got very little business from them. And in fact, those tracks didn't really stay there for all that length of time. This picture appeared in a national magazine called Stone. And you talk about Stone magazine. Well, the name of it wasn't Stone magazine. The name of it was Stone. But anyway, it was a national magazine, and this picture was in it. And they're not being entirely honest with us in this picture. There is no way that locomotive could pull that trainload of cars up that steep grade that I showed you, talked about. So there had to be some engines off camera waiting to hook up to help get it up those hills. If in fact they even did it in one consist, they could have divided up to get it up the hill. Anyway, there is that spot today.
Go back.
Now, I can't give a program about railroads or the limestone business or anything without showing this picture, because they're not being honest with us either, and I always want everybody to know that. Those columns were quarried and turned on a lathe up in the Dark Hollow area in that quarry, and then they were shipped to the State House at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in the early 1920s. If you're going from northwest of Bedford to Harrisburg, which is northeast of Bedford, Bedford's not on the way. And in fact, with a steam locomotive, there's no way you can drive through Bedford and turn around and go back. No, that didn't happen. That train came out of Dark Hollow, came into Bedford, started north, stopped on a Y, they threw some switches, and it backed downtown so they could get that photograph. Believe me, the stone business were masters at marketing, at advertising, and public relations. So, fake news. Now, back to that spot where I just showed you where that train was. The blue line indicates the Monon where it had been the Bedford and Bloomfield narrow gauge. See where the blue line's going up and you see that straight fill down through there? It came down across Salt Creek and tied into the Monon down here. Okay, so you know what's going on there. That appeared in Stone magazine. And these were national magazines. This wasn't a local magazine. This was a national magazine.
When was the magazine published? What years?
I'm sorry, what?
What years was the magazine published?
I have no idea. These pictures are turn of the 20th century, you know. These primarily in the 1890s, or maybe a little later. There's where that picture was taken. And then another picture of the same era is that wooden trestle. I don't know where that is exactly, or was exactly. There are two spots where it might have been, and you just can't tell from the picture which one it was. Now, let's go back and talk about the Bedford Belt paralleling the 4-lane. And it's easy to see where it ran. At least you used to easily see it. Now you can't easily see it in the wintertime. And back in the 80s, there's the 4-lane, and there's where the Bedford Belt ran. Now, in the 30, 35 years since then, there's a forest that's grown up between the tracks where they used to be and the 4-lane. But in the wintertime, you can see where it was, especially as you get closer and closer to Oolitic. You can look over and you see the huge stone blocks for the fill leading into Oolitic. Now, we'll get ourselves acquainted here with Oolitic, and the red arrow down by the name Oolitic shows where the Bedford Belt was coming into Oolitic. It was curving through what they call a stacking yard, heading northeast up to the top. We have Old Highway 37, the Bedford to Oolitic Road, which once it gets to Oolitic, they call it the Hoosier Avenue. Main drag through Oolitic going north. Now, instead of at the stoplight there in Oolitic and turning west to get on the 4-line, the old 37 continued north on up. But further to the right is what I call Old Highway 37, which now they call Lafayette Avenue. That's running along the edge of that precipice that heads down to Salt Creek. And it's a street in Oolitic, but that's the old Bedford-Oolitic Road. That's the old Dixie Highway. So, get that in your mind's eye. There's that stacking yard, and you see up in the upper left, Old 37. And there is the depot in Oolitic for the Bedford Belt. Now you're saying, what's it doing there instead of downtown? They were thinking in terms of stone business, not necessarily people. So it was more important to have the depot out toward the quarry fields. In 1937, there's where the site of that depot was, and you can see the old tracks are still in the ground there. And Old 37, you can see where it's heading into Bedford there in the middle left. In 1936, the WPA moved that depot up to between the old high school buildings in Oolitic. Now, next time you're going to Bloomington, go through Oolitic and past the two old buildings of the Oolitic High School, and you'll see that structure between the two. That's the depot for the Bedford Belt that used to be out north of town. And you see the part that sticks out like you always see on a railroad depot, the bay window effect. Now, these two pictures were taken at different times. In the top and the bottom both have a red arrow that is pointing out those four, what they call clubhouses. I'm not sure why they were called clubhouses, but they were houses built by John R. Walsh to entertain dignitaries, salesmen, stone people that are coming to Bedford to do business. There's one big one and three lesser in size. Well, at the top picture, the old 37 is going right by them. In the bottom picture, old 37 was upgraded to the old 37 that we remember, and it bypassed those four houses. You can see where the main 37 now is different than it is in the top picture. Everybody see that? Well, that is Lafayette Avenue, and that's old 37, heading up to the houses that are on the right, and they're still there. And that's what it looked like back when it was the old 37. And you see the tracks from the Bedford Belt, and you see that retaining wall right by the tracks on the right. Remember that for a minute. A little then and now. Okay, that retaining wall held the dirt back, and the railroad, we're standing where the railroad went. And to the right, you can't see it, but just if I were to step off, 10 or 12 feet from where I am now, I would be falling down a precipice to Salt Creek. That's what they call a shelf road. There's a hill, and they've cut out the side of it till now that's a shelf, and the hill continues on down. So there's the first clubhouse, the big one. And so the railroad would come up through there, and it would arrive at a spot where now there's an entryway in that retaining wall where they could put a plank out from the passenger car, and the people could step right off the car into the building. Service with a smile. Now look in the lower left where we have the stoplight on the 4-lane at Oolitic. And you saw this back on the Monon talk, but now we're going to concentrate more on the trestle than we are on the tracks to the left. Remember, the Bedford to Bloomfield was a narrow gauge, and when the Monon Railroad bought it, they made it a standard gauge out to the Oolitic area to get standard cars and narrow gauge cars to be moving in. But quite soon after doing that, they standardized the whole railroad to Bloomfield. Excuse me, but when this picture was taken, it's now got 3 rails for both standard and narrow gauge. But the trestle is what concerns us now. When you go through the stoplight there, you're going underneath this trestle. And if you don't believe that, there's the picture on the trestle looking at the stone mill. That mill burned, and it was replaced pretty much on the same spot by the Indiana Limestone Company mill that you see there today, just on the east side of the road at the stoplight in Oolitic. It's a big building, huge. Now, this was the Bedford Belt Railroad on the trestle to get over to the quarries on the east side or on the west side in the Patton Hill area where there was a lot of quarrying going on. So both of these competing railroads wanted to have track into the major quarries. Okay, we're back to remind you that the Bedford Belt was part of the southern Indiana. And where Central Foundry is today, back when this map was made, all the blue buildings are stone mills. But Bedford was the hub of the Southern Indiana Railroad, or railway. And by being a hub, they had shops where I don't know if cars were built, but I certainly know that they were maintained, repaired, painted, and that was all done in those red buildings, and there was a roundhouse and a turntable as all part of all those tracks. Remember, the Southern Indiana yards started out back close to I Street, but later when they built all this, the major yards for the Southern Indiana Railroad were moved up here where you see the sign Southern Indiana Railway Yards. And on an old Sanborn map, the Southern Indiana yard buildings, repair shops and all, and roundhouse are all in blue. And they're on an aerial photograph. Now that shows the roundhouse, and you can see the stone mills in the distance. There's 2 stone mills back there, and then the rest of those buildings are all Southern Indiana Railway buildings. And a close-up, there are 8 steam locomotives in that picture. And the roundhouse and the turntable. Everybody knows what a turntable is. Okay. And here we have some more pictures. Don't ask me to explain what's going on with that smokestack. The detached flying smokestack notice that old railroad passenger car that's no longer on wheels, they're on the right. That's some kind of a shop or an office, who knows. But it's a car that's seen better days as a railway car. Now here's the turntable and the roundhouse. Notice that stick up right there. You all see that? That was a very substantial lever sticking up from the turntable that a man would grab a hold of and push to move the turntable. It was a manually operated turntable, and so well balanced, and they'd get the locomotive and tender so well balanced on there that a man, maybe a couple of men, could turn the turntable to turn the locomotive. And that's what you're seeing right there.
Commonly called an Armstrong turntable.
I'm sorry?
Commonly called an Armstrong turntable.
Armstrong.
There's the paint shops. And we've got some internal pictures. There's a cow catcher. And we see a locomotive in the background, either being built or repaired. I don't know which.
Looks like danger.
Now this picture was taken probably in the 60s, and that's all Central Foundry except for the stone mill in the far right. But you see, this is all Central Foundry in the left part. But you see, the old Southern Indiana shops are now derelict. They've lost their roofs. The roundhouse is still there, and it still has a roof, but the other buildings are in bad shape. The yard is still functioning as a yard for that railroad, but no longer do they have shops there. And it was no longer, of course, the Southern Indiana here, and by now it's one of the Milwaukee names. The Milwaukee was never the official name of the railroad. It was always some other name, and everybody called it the Milwaukee.
How to get the name Milwaukee?
Because one of the cities it ran to, it was the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. And here's a close-up of that showing you and in this picture, in the very waning years of the Milwaukee Railroad, you can see those buildings in the background. They were certainly there in the 80s. I don't know when, and maybe in the 90s, I don't know. Now, Central Foundry has expanded, and they're no longer there. Now, this picture was taken back in 1950. The Milwaukee quit running passengers in 1950, even though it ran freight for a long time after that. Here are Mr. and Mrs. Aurelie Jones of Bedford, who rode the first train on the line out of Bedford in 1890, who bought tickets 60 years later for the final Milwaukee run. That picture ought to be in the depot, you know. Well, when a railroad, I just want to explain the term abandonment. When a railroad wants to go out of business as far as operating a certain amount of track, the railroad itself isn't going out. You just doesn't want to run trains on that track anymore. And generally they haven't for a few years before they get around to apply to the appropriate government agency to get their approval to abandon those tracks. And when they get that approval, then they they certainly will go in and sell the rails and whatever else they can scavenge to salvagers who will buy that sort of thing. And then they either sell the land or it goes back to the original people on it, whatever the law decides is the appropriate thing to do. But now, you know, the railroad has nothing more to do with that. They're out of it. Well, the Bedford to Seymour part of the Milwaukee was abandoned in 1978. The tracks lasted a lot longer than that, but it was officially abandoned. The Bedford Belt to Oolitic was abandoned in 1985, and it wasn't too long after that when they pulled the tracks. And the Bedford to Crane part was abandoned in 2009. And of course, that's the Rails to Trail, Milwaukee Trail we all know. Now, if anybody wants to know more about this particular railroad, Volume 2 of my Abandoned Railroads of Bedford, a Photographic Atlas, is here in the museum. There's 3 volumes. Remember I said I walked 100 miles. I took photographs all along, even the very uninteresting parts. But by golly, I walked it, and I was going to take a picture of it. And now, in railroad talk, we have come to the end of the line.